The paper felt cold in my hands, but the shock in my chest was even colder. I had just found it, my husband's will. And as my eyes scanned the page, my stomach dropped. I wasn't there. Not a single mention of me. Years of marriage, decades of sacrifice, and there I was, erased. How could this be? How could the life we built, the love we shared, mean so little that I wasn't even considered in his final wishes? I had given everything for our family. I had been his partner in every way. Yet, in that moment, it felt as if I had never mattered at all. I stood there, alone in the room, staring at the paper, struggling to breathe. The house we had shared, the memories we had made, none of it mattered now. The silence in the room was deafening. I was left with just one question. How could someone I loved so much simply forget me? But then, in the silence, something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to let this piece of paper define who I was. I wasn't going to let him take my worth away with just a few words. I would find my strength again. And that's when I realized this wasn't the end of my story. This was just the beginning of me reclaiming my life. The silence was suffocating as Mama sat there, staring at the will. It felt as though time itself had stopped. The paper trembled in her hands, as if it too understood the weight of what it contained. Her name was missing, plain and simple. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a clerical error, perhaps. She read through the document again, her fingers running over the words as if they might change with another glance. But they didn't. Her name was absent, and there was no mention of her in the list of bequests. She could feel the room growing colder, the air thick with an invisible presence that made it harder to breathe. It wasn't just the absence of her name, it was the cold finality that accompanied it. The realization that she had been erased from the life they had built together, that all the years she had given him, all the sacrifices, all the shared moments, meant nothing. The will wasn't just a document. It was a declaration that she had been discarded, left behind, forgotten. As the truth settled in, it didn't come with anger, at least not at first. Instead, it was a quiet, steady ache, the kind that seeps into your bones and leaves you hollow. She had given him everything, her love, her loyalty, her trust. And this was how it ended? The silence stretched out, and with it, her mind began to race, searching for answers. Had she missed something? Had she failed him somehow? Mama thought back to their life together, their shared moments, the subtle signs that now seemed so clear in hindsight. The last few months had been different, hadn't they? She had noticed it, but she had told herself it was just a phase. The distance between them had been small at first, almost imperceptible, but it had grown. She had tried to ignore it, to push it aside, but the truth was there now, staring her in the face. He had stopped trying. She hadn't seen it, hadn't wanted to see it. He had been pulling away for months, maybe even years. The man she had once shared her life with had already begun to check out, to distance himself emotionally and physically. She had been blind to it, lost in her own world, thinking that their love was enough to weather any storm. But it wasn't. As the tears began to fall, they were not the tears of anger or rage that she had expected. They were the tears of someone who had been abandoned in the quietest way possible. There had been no shouting, No dramatic arguments, no explosive fights. The betrayal had been far more subtle, a slow, insidious erosion of everything they had built. It was a betrayal not of the heart, but of the soul. He had not even had the decency to say goodbye. Instead, he had simply let her fade into the background of his life. Her mind drifted to their last conversation, the night they had sat across from each other, barely speaking. The silence between them had been deafening, but she had brushed it off. It was just a rough patch. We'll get through it. But now, she understood. He had already checked out. He had already made his decision long before the will was written. He had already made peace with the idea that she wasn't part of his future. And then, another thought struck her, more painful than the first. Had he been preparing for this all along? Had he slowly been disengaging from her, emotionally and mentally, until he had no more room for her in his life? The will wasn't just a document. It was the culmination of years of emotional distance, years of silence, and years of unspoken feelings. It wasn't just the will that hurt. It was the realization that she had been living in a fantasy, clinging to a version of their relationship that didn't exist anymore. She had been so focused on what they had been, on what they could have been, that she hadn't seen the truth. He had already moved on, and she hadn't been able to catch up. The betrayal was not loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, and that was what made it so much worse. Mama wasn't angry. She was grieving for the relationship that had already died, grieving for the love that had slipped through her fingers without her even realizing it, grieving for the years she had spent trying to hold on to something that had long since faded. And so, as she sat there, alone with the will in her hands, Mama understood something. She understood that this wasn't about the will, about the inheritance. It was about something much deeper. It was about the loss of connection, the loss of love, and the loss of her place in his life. It was a betrayal that didn't scream or shout, but one that settled quietly in the spaces between them, until there was nothing left but silence. The days that followed felt like a long, endless echo of the silence that had always been there, but had now grown impossible to ignore. Mama walked through the house as though it belonged to someone else, each step heavier than the last. The walls, once filled with laughter, now seemed cold and distant. The photographs on the walls, birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, were all that remained of a life she once thought was secure, but now they looked like faded memories of someone else's story. Her house felt more like a museum of lost time than a home. She ran her fingers along the furniture, tracing the familiar shapes, but everything felt hollow. She would catch a glimpse of something, a cufflink he had left on the kitchen counter, a half-read book that was once theirs, the mail that still arrived with his name on it, and each moment was like a fresh wound. These were remnants of a love that had slowly disappeared, unnoticed, over the years. It wasn't just that he was gone. It was that she had never truly been seen. How many years had she spent pouring herself into this marriage, thinking that love would be enough? And yet, it wasn't. It wasn't enough to keep him from pulling away. It wasn't enough to stop the slow, steady erosion of everything they had once shared. Every corner of the house now reminded her of how distant they had become, how much she had ignored, how often she had tried to fill the silence with words that he never seemed to hear. For years, she had kept up appearances, cooking, cleaning, caring for the family, always striving to be the partner he had promised to be with. But there had been no real connection for a long time, just routines and rituals. She remembered the last anniversary they had celebrated together. He had barely looked up from his newspaper, too lost in his own thoughts to even acknowledge the small, heartfelt gift she had given him. She had told herself it was just a bad day, a bad moment. But now, in the painful clarity that the will had forced upon her, Mama realized it wasn't just a moment. It was a pattern, a slow withdrawal that she had been too afraid to recognize. The betrayal didn't come with shouting or fights. It came with the quiet distance that had settled between them, so subtle that neither of them had noticed it until it was too late. But she had felt it, the hollow space that had grown between them, the absence of words, the silences that stretched too long to be ignored. She had tried to fill them with actions, but nothing seemed to reach him anymore. The pain was not just in the absence of her name on the will. It was in the realization that, for years, she had been living with a man who had already checked out emotionally, long before the papers had been signed. The will wasn't just a legal document. It was a symbol of how far apart they had drifted, how much of their connection had died without either of them addressing it. It was a slow suffocation of the love she had cherished. And Mama realized now that she had been suffocating right along with it. Too proud, too hopeful to see the truth. Her chest ached with the weight of it all. It wasn't just that he hadn't left her anything in the will. It was the fact that he had forgotten about her. He had stopped looking at her, stopped seeing her as his partner, as someone to share the rest of his life with. She had been living in the shadow of what he had once promised, but those promises had faded, and she hadn't even noticed when they were gone. There were moments when she would sit by the window, staring out at the world that kept moving while hers stood still. She wondered if anyone had ever really known her, really seen her the way she had seen them. All those years spent nurturing a relationship that now seemed like a stranger story. And yet, Mama couldn't shake the feeling that even though he had been physically present all those years, in many ways, she had been alone from the start. The grief was suffocating. It wasn't just sadness. It was a deep, gnawing ache. The kind that comes with realizing that the person you have loved, with everything you have, has, without warning, erased you from his life, and you never even knew it was happening. It wasn't just the physical absence of him, but the emotional emptiness that had grown so wide between them. Mama had spent so long filling her life with his presence, but now that he was gone, she was left with nothing but the echoes of a relationship that had never truly been whole. She had been a part of his life, but in the end, she had never been seen. And it hurt. More than she could ever put into words. To know that the one person who was supposed to see you, to love you, had stopped seeing you long before you realized it. To be forgotten, not just in a will, but in every small moment that led up to that point. The silence of their final years together had been louder than any argument they could have had. As Mama sat there in the house, surrounded by memories that no longer felt like her own, she understood something. The pain wasn't just about being left out of the will. It was about the years of silence, the slow withdrawal of love that had been hidden behind a veil of routine. And now, it was time to face the truth. She had been living with a ghost for too long. It wasn't until the third time Mama read through the will that the doubt began to take root. At first, she had brushed it aside as a mistake, a simple oversight perhaps. But now, as she traced the words again with her fingers, the absence of her name lingered like a cold draft, impossible to ignore. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. Her husband had always been a man of quiet strength, someone who could keep his emotions close, almost too close. Mama had never doubted his love, even in the silent years that had passed between them. But now, reading this document, it was as though a wall had been built between them, one that was never there before. She blinked, the weight of the words pressing down on her chest. Her name was nowhere. Not a single mention. No bequest to her. No legacy. No acknowledgement of their life together. It felt like the world had suddenly turned upside down. But as she sat there, a strange clarity washed over her. This wasn't just about the will. The absence of her name was the culmination of something deeper, something that had quietly festered for years. There had been a shift in their marriage, a drift that neither of them had addressed. Mama thought back to the last months of their life together. The distance between them had been subtle, almost imperceptible, like a silent tide creeping in. She had felt it, yes, the longer silences, the unspoken words that hung between them. But she had always been hopeful, always told herself that it was just a phase. Had she missed something? Had he been pulling away all this time? Was it her fault for not seeing the signs, for not asking the hard questions? She hadn't wanted to face the truth. It was easier to live in the comfort of routine, to ignore the tension that lingered like an unspoken accusation. But the will was different. The will was final. It was the answer she had been too afraid to ask. Her hands trembled as she closed the document and put it aside. She needed space to think, to breathe. That was when she noticed it, an old journal that had been wedged between the back pages of a drawer. She had almost forgotten about it. It was his handwriting, but it wasn't just a will. It was his thoughts, his fears, his frustrations. The words inside weren't meant for anyone else. They were a confession, a raw, unfiltered view into the mind of the man she had shared her life with. The first few pages were filled with everyday details, mundane but familiar. The grocery lists, the notes about their children, the reminders for household chores. But as she flipped through the pages, the entries grew less structured, more introspective. He had written about the weight of their years together, the changes that had slowly crept in. There were mentions of moments he felt unseen, of times when he longed for more than just the routine. One entry caught her eye. "I don't know how to talk to her anymore. We're strangers living in the same house." It was like a punch to the gut. The truth she had been avoiding hit her all at once, and the realization wasn't as clean as she expected. It wasn't anger or betrayal that she felt. It was an overwhelming sadness, a deep, aching grief for the connection that had quietly slipped away. As she read, Mama felt her heart breaking, not from the words he had written, but from the acknowledgement that, somewhere along the way, they had both stopped trying. They had built a life together, but somewhere in the process, they had forgotten how to love each other. The will wasn't just about inheritance, it was about the inheritance of their lost connection, the pieces of their relationship that had been forgotten, buried under years of silence. She closed the journal, tears welling up in her eyes. It wasn't just a matter of him leaving her out of the will. It was about the years they had wasted, the love that had faded without either of them acknowledging it. There was no grand betrayal, no dramatic moment of abandonment. It was much quieter than that. It was the slow, unspoken erosion of something that once felt solid and unbreakable. Mama sat there in the silence, letting the weight of it all settle in. But it wasn't just sadness that lingered. There was something else, something small but persistent, a seed of understanding. He hadn't left her because he didn't love her. He had left her out of the will because he didn't know how to be with her anymore. He had given up on the relationship long before the will was ever written. It wasn't forgiveness that Mama felt, not yet. But she felt something begin to shift inside her. The anger that had first flared up when she discovered the will had begun to fade, replaced by an acceptance of what was. This wasn't the life she had envisioned, but it was the life she had. And it was time to stop mourning what could have been. She placed the journal back in the drawer, this time with a sense of finality. She wasn't going to spend another moment looking for answers in the past. The truth was there, buried in the pages, but it was no longer something she needed to carry with her. For the first time in a long while, Mama felt the stirrings of something new, a quiet, almost imperceptible strength. She didn't need the will, the inheritance, or even the memories. She just needed to start living again, on her own terms. And with that, Mama stood up, leaving the drawer open behind her. The past was there, but it was no longer her burden to carry. Mama stood in the quiet of the garden, the morning light filtering through the leaves, casting gentle shadows across the ground. The world outside was waking up, but within these walls, everything had felt frozen. Until now. She had spent too long letting the silence eat away at her, too long letting the hurt define her existence. But this morning, there was something different. A quiet resolve had settled in her heart, a sense of strength she hadn't known she had. She walked slowly to the back of the garden, her fingers brushing against the cool stone path, each step purposeful. The roses, once carefully tended by his hands, had grown wild, untamed. But now, as she stood before them, Mama saw them differently. They were no longer just his roses. They were hers, too. They had always been hers. As she moved through the garden, she reached the small plot where they had once planted their favorite flowers. He had always said that these flowers were a symbol of their love, their growing bond. But today, it was different. She reached down, her fingers finding the soft soil beneath her. She had always been the one to keep things alive, to nurture and care. And now, it was her turn to nurture herself. With a steady hand, Mama began digging. The soil was damp, rich with the memories of seasons past. It was hard work, but it felt good. She wasn't just planting flowers. She was planting her future, her own sense of purpose. For the first time, she wasn't just a caretaker of things that belonged to someone else. She was creating something new, something entirely her own. She paused for a moment, the quiet of the garden settling around her. She could hear the birds singing, the wind rustling through the trees. The peace she had been seeking had always been here, waiting for her to claim it. The pain of the past, the hurt from the will, from his absence, it was still there, but it no longer held the same power over her. She had done the hard work of facing it, and now she was moving forward. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything to him or to anyone else. The justice she sought wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quiet kind, the kind that comes from within, the kind that rises when you finally decide to take control of your own life, when you refuse to be defined by someone else's actions. She stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands, and looked at the small plant she had just placed in the soil. It wasn't much yet, but it would grow, just as she would. Mama didn't need to prove her worth. She had always been worthy, even when no one saw it, even when she had forgotten it herself. The flowers in the garden, the ones he had once cared for, now represented more than memories. They were a symbol of her own resilience, her ability to rebuild, to start anew. As Mama stood in the garden, she realized that the justice she had been waiting for was not in his acknowledgement, not in his approval, but in her own. The power to heal, to move forward, had always been in her hands. The will might have left her out, but it could never erase the woman she had become, the strength she had cultivated through years of love, pain, and endurance. She didn't need his validation. She didn't need anyone's permission to live her life. She had already begun to do it, to carve out a space for herself in the world. The garden, her small act of creation, was the proof that she was no longer waiting for someone else to give her the life she deserved. She was taking it for herself. Mama didn't need to fight for justice. She had already found it in the quiet moments, in the slow, steady reclamation of herself. It wasn't about what she had lost. It was about what she was about to build. With the sun rising higher in the sky, Mama stood tall, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She didn't need to look back anymore. She had her own path to walk, and this time she was walking it alone, but with a strength she had never known she had. The sunlight poured softly through the curtains, casting a gentle warmth across the room. Mama sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, the familiar scent of chamomile soothing her senses. The world outside was waking up, but it was different now. The heaviness that had clung to her for so long was beginning to lift, though it wasn't quick or easy. It was the slow, steady kind of healing, the kind that doesn't come from grand gestures or sudden revelations, but from the quiet moments of reflection and acceptance. She had spent days in the garden, pulling weeds, planting new life, and tending to the space that had once belonged to both of them. But now, the garden was hers. The roses, the ivy, the oak tree, they were symbols of resilience, and today, they felt like symbols of her own recovery. The act of planting wasn't just about the flowers. It was about reclaiming what had been taken and turning it into something new. She stood at the edge of the garden, taking in the view, feeling the quiet hum of life all around her. The birds had returned, the wind rustled through the trees, and the soil beneath her hands was rich with potential. It was as if the garden, like her, had been given a second chance. And it was through this quiet reclamation of her space that Mama began to realize the deeper healing happening within her. For so long, she had tried to fill the silence with her own efforts, striving to make things right, to restore what was broken. But now, she understood that healing wasn't about fixing something that couldn't be fixed. It wasn't about bringing back the past or holding on to what was no longer hers. It was about accepting that things had changed and that she could still move forward. She reached down, her fingers brushing the petals of a new flower she had planted, one that wasn't there before, one that symbolized the new life she was building for herself. The earth was warm beneath her, and for the first time, she felt grounded, truly connected to the present moment. She had spent so long waiting for someone else to acknowledge her worth, but now she saw it for herself. She had been enough all along. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal, nor the silence that had followed. It was the letting go of the hope that things would go back to the way they were, letting go of the future she had imagined, the one that no longer existed. But in that quiet surrender, Mama found something unexpected. Freedom. She had been holding on to so much anger, disappointment, resentment for so long, trying to make sense of it all. But now, she could finally see that the weight of those feelings had been dragging her down. She no longer needed them. She had the power to decide what mattered now, to choose what she carried forward with her. With each passing day, the healing became less about the pain and more about the possibility. Mama began to look forward instead of backward. She started to imagine a future for herself, a future not defined by anyone else, but by the choices she made. She had let go of the past, not because it didn't matter, but because she understood that it was time to stop living for someone else's approval, someone else's expectations. The tea in her hands had cooled by now, but she didn't mind. The warmth inside her was all she needed. She had found a new rhythm in life, a rhythm that came from within, one that didn't require validation, didn't require anyone else to say that she was enough. She was enough. She had always been. And as she stood there, surrounded by the garden she had nurtured, she realized that healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about learning how to live alongside it, how to grow in spite of it. The garden, now filled with new life, was a reflection of that. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, just as she was. She didn't need to wait for someone else to give her the life she deserved. She could create it for herself, one small step at a time. With a deep breath, Mama stepped back into the house, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had no idea what the future would hold, but for the first time, it felt like she was walking toward it with purpose. She wasn't running from the past anymore. She was moving toward her own life, the life she had always deserved, but had only just begun to claim. Mama stepped outside into the light, the warmth of the sun on her face, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a peace she had been searching for. The past no longer controlled her. The betrayal, the anger, the silence, it all began to fade. She had chosen herself. She had finally seen the truth. Her worth was never tied to anyone else's acknowledgement. It was always within her. The journey hadn't been easy, and it wasn't over. But Mama now knew that her strength didn't come from being validated by someone else. Her strength came from choosing to live for herself, from deciding that she would not be defined by what others took from her. If you've ever been made to feel small, erased, or invisible, know this: you are not alone. The life you deserve is waiting for you, but it begins with one simple step. You are enough, and no one can take that away from you. If this story has resonated with you, if it has touched something deep within, share it. Let's create a community where we lift each other up, where we find our voices again, and where we choose to heal together. The road to reclaiming your life starts with one decision, one step forward. And remember, the past doesn't have to define you. You decide what comes next.